Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in a series of webinars being offered by the Demographic Data Collaborative of the James Irvine Foundation, the Weingart Foundation, the California Endowment, a series of webinars that's being hosted to center nonprofit capacity building around demographic data. The webinar is started, it's being recorded, and will be available at the end of all 5 sessions along with supporting materials. Just as a reminder, the California Demographic Data Collaboration is a collaboration of the 3 foundations mentioned who came together to join efforts to learn and explore solutions to ease the burdens on the nonprofits that they supported and to seize opportunities related to learning from demographic data. All of this is with the shared goal of a commitment to equity and justice. So this is a series, as I mentioned, of webinars along with supporting materials that is designed to build on the existing capacity of nonprofits to really collect, engage, and effectively use demographics. My name is Kelly Brown, and I'm the CEO of Viewpoint Consulting. I've been working with the collaborative for a number of years. Myself and my colleagues, Megan McVetti and Audrey Campbell, have been working with the Demographic Data Collaborative on this project for several years to really strengthen the capacity of nonprofits to engage demographic data. And the webinars that we're offering today grew out of the learning and engagement that we had with all of their grantee partners around what was needed and what supports were required, were they looking for in order to strengthen their work. I've been leading these webinars. I will give a little bit of framing today for the conversation, but most of what we'll do in the 50-minute session that we are about to embark on is be in conversation with our guest, Ali Van Heest from the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. Ali is a community investment officer at the foundation in Michigan, and an early partner of in Candid's Demographics via Candid campaign. So we'll hear a little bit more about from Ali and how the Kalamazoo Community Foundation is engaging and using demographic data. And hopefully, as I mentioned, while Ali and I will be in conversation, we'll also be in conversation with you, because we really want to encourage folks to actively participate in the conversation. We saw a lot of energy in the last session, so people will be able to participate through the chat. It is enabled for everyone. And the Q&A, which is in which you can put and share your questions if folks want to engage. We'll be moderating and watching that area closely to ensure that we get your comments and questions onto the table. So just as a recap of the first 3 sessions, quickly, we started the series of 5 with kind of why are demographics important? What is it? Why is it important to know who you're engaging and who your leadership and staff are? How does that impact and strengthen your work and deepen your relevance in communities? In the second session, we focused on the what. What kinds of demographic data demographics should you collect? How do you think about the taxonomies and tools that you use to get that data? Understanding the categories and how they change in terms of how people identify, reducing hopefully some of the anxiety around how categories and identities change and evolve over time, and giving you some insights into how to build tools that allow for that kind of evolution. In the last session, the third session, we focused on data collection mechanisms. How do you get this data? Talked a little bit about the difference between survey data and administrative data. Focused on issues around privacy and consent and being clear and transparent with individuals around how you're going to use this data. So the way you get demographics is done respectfully, appropriately, and effectively. And assuring people, reminding folks that this is the kind of data and questions that people are quite used to answering. So folks shouldn't be afraid of engaging people around it, but they should do it respectfully and appropriately. So today, what we're going to do is at a very high level, I'm going to give a little bit of framing around, putting the data to work. How do you use demographic data? We definitely want to hear from you how you are using it currently and how you could use it more effectively. And that will be the bulk of the conversation that we have with Ali this morning. We're going to touch a little bit on the legal landscape because we know those questions and concerns have come up. We are in an environment where some of that is in play, some of those issues are in play. So we want to at least raise and surface the dynamism in that space and give you some insights and some guidelines for how you can engage your own constituencies around these issues, but also to ensure that we don't want anyone to be overly concerned or afraid, but we do want people to understand that this is an arena around inclusion and diversity and equity are areas that are being actively engaged in certain sectors of our communities. So as we often do, as we have in previous sessions, we want to start with a little poll and ask you, how are you using demographic data? We know that from previous sessions and previous conversations that we've had with folks, that many of you who are coming to these sessions are already engaged with demographics, across the spectrum in different kinds of ways. But you really want to get a sense of how you all are using it. And we hope that as we move into the conversation, you'll begin to, you'll have the opportunity to share how you're using it and questions around on how you can use it better. So it's interesting. It looks like there is, there's a fair degree of equal uses in terms of staff development, informing program, communicating about your work, reporting. We know that reporting is a big area in terms of how folks, what motivates people to engage this data. So this is super helpful across the board, and it's not too many people are not using it yet, but there are still some who might benefit from this conversation. So let's end the poll. Let's share the results. You can see the dispersion there. So that's where that gives us some foundation. So at the higher level, again, this is information and data that can really strengthen your organization's ability to be responsive to the current population and to changes in the population. Again, whether you're doing direct service, whether you're an advocacy organization, whether you're doing policy work, whether you're doing messaging or communications, whether you're doing research, all of that happens in the context of a community and a population that it's important to know about. It's important to know who and how to recruit the staff and talent that you use to design and implement and engage all of those programs. And having demographic data can really strengthen your ability to access talent, to understand what perspectives may need to be brought to bear to what you're doing, and to really get the most out of a range of talent. It's important, though, to remember that the data is almost just the starting place. It's not just about representation. It's not just about numbers and dashboards and thresholds. It's really information that it can form subsequent strategies and information around how do you really lean into understanding how the who of what you do is important to what you do. We know that this data can strengthen insight into program design, that even when you think you're doing a good program, even when you think you're not intending to exclude anyone, even when you think it's for everyone, really understanding the populations that you're impacting and how they're changing over time can really provide information, key information into how to design and refine and improve programs, even programs that you think are doing well. It's also important that you understand the continuation of your human capital, from your boards to your senior staff to your stakeholders. Oftentimes these different constituency groups are considered quite separate from each other. But if you're really wanting to be effective, you really have to understand the continuum and the relationship between these different stakeholders. And this is often why foundations ask for, or other entities ask for the demographics of your leadership, is because they understand that this matters to the kind of talent that you can bring to bear to your efforts. So we know that you collect a lot of data. We know that you report a lot of data. We know that some of it is useful and some of it is less useful, but we really want to emphasize that even when you're collecting a lot of data on different kinds of things, there are always opportunities for you to think about how do you use data to understand who is missing, what voices are not out there, how are things changing, and how is this kind of data that we're collecting really informing and strengthening our works, and not just being used as an exercise to report, but really to inform what we're doing. So before we move into conversation with Ali, as I mentioned, I wanted to touch on what we're calling, the legal landscape. A lot of folks often raise the issue around whether or not engaging identity and demographics is illegal, and the service in lots of different areas. And while we're not equipped to provide you with legal advice, and we were trying to get an attorney to be on the call today. It wasn't working out, but even if we had, the context right now is so dynamic that it's really difficult to define some definitive answers with respect to legal issues. But for the most part, the laws governing demographics and identity relate to Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or age. And there are many provisions within the Civil Rights Act that relate largely to employment and contracting. And for people who get contracts from the federal government, there are clear prohibitions on discrimination with respect to these parameters. That law, as many of you may know, was designed to redress centuries of discrimination along these lines, and to really institutionalize and enshrine at a federal level prohibitions around this. As we have seen since we've moved on in almost 60 years since that law, number of these provisions are now encountering a number of some scrutiny. And so it really is an area that folks need to watch in terms of how people are thinking about what does discrimination mean, how is it being defined, how is it being counted and categorized. And we know at the federal level, there's Title VII, but at the state level, many states are taking lots of different approaches, in some cases enacting laws or bills and regulations that expand the ability for government and entities and businesses and what have you to understand and better account for whether or not there's discrimination with respect along these parameters. Whereas in other places, there's actions that are moving in order to constrain people's and entities' abilities to track discrimination and exclusion. So it really is quite a live arena that folks have to pay attention to. What we can say is right now, Title VII requires that employers, and this relates to how nonprofits operate as employers and as contractors. It requires employers that have over 100 more employees to file demographic surveys of their employees with the EEOC. So in other words, if you have at least 100 employees or more, you have to collect this data and file it with the EEOC to ensure or to track whether or not, in fact, there is equal opportunity with respect to employment. As I mentioned, what is under scrutiny now is how discrimination is defined and it is determined. And one of the cases that many of you may be aware of that is on the Supreme Court's docket right now, and is we're anticipating some decisions, is respect to how courts are thinking about affirmative action and the use of race in particular with respect to admissions policies. Some of you may be very familiar with that law, and there is, or that case that is being that is on the court's docket right now. We are going to put in the chat actually some a brief that was commissioned by the Hewlett Foundation that provides an assessment, I would say a conservative assessment of worst case scenario in terms of how that decision, what happens with that decision may or may not impact nonprofits and may or may not impact foundations and funders. And we want to share it in the sense of full transparency because we think people will have more information, it's better. But we really do want to caution folks to understand that this is not settled law. This is not an opinion. This is not for sure. They outline a range of scenarios. And there are a number of folks who are also doing intensive legal work to understand how can, in whatever way the Supreme Court rules, folks can still continue to use information and to use demographics to advance equity and inclusion. So let me pause there before we transition into our conversation with Ali, where we will actually go into much more specifics around how they are using this data, how they are finding the organizations that they work in Michigan are engaging and using this data, and hopefully that's when you can really join in with your perspectives and questions. But I just want to pause and see if there are any questions or things that people want to raise before we transition. Megan, not seeing anything, not hearing anything?
Nope. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and as Kelly and Ali are talking, please feel free to use the chat and Q&A. We'll be monitoring that and bringing those forward.
Great. Yes, please do. Oh, wait, is there something there?
Thank you for this resource for the Hewlett memo.
Yeah, great. And just as a reminder, we're putting this in the chat now, but again, as I keep mentioning, at the end of all 5 sessions, we will be providing everyone with all of the decks, all of the webinars, and supplemental written materials to support the content that we're providing, so that folks can have this at their fingertips as they move forward. So as I mentioned, we're going to be in conversation with Ali Van Heest from the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. She is a community investment officer at the foundation. In her role, she facilitates and has been directing the inaugural effort around collecting demographic data from their grantees. And the Kalamazoo Community Foundation did a fair amount of work, and you'll hear more when she talks about engaging the groups that they fund and the communities in which they fund around this data and the rationale for it. So I will let Ali kind of give us a little bit of background, and maybe just start out, Ali, saying, what brought the foundation to a recognition that this was the kind of data that it really needed to better inform its grant makers and support its partners.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Greetings, everyone from Michigan. It's exciting to be here with you all this afternoon. So what you're looking at here on this slide, our mission at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation to mobilize people, resources, and expertise to advance racial, social, and economic justice, was really the starting point of our journey towards engaging with demographic data. Over the course of late 2020 and early 2021, we dreamed up this mission, adopted this mission, and in tandem with that process, really overhauled our grant-making priorities and landed on racial equity as our central grant-making priority across all sectors that we fund here in Kalamazoo County. And what we arrived at through that process was the clarity that if we're saying this is the work that we're doing, that our priority is racial equity, that our mission is to mobilize our resources towards racial justice and the pursuit of racial justice, we need our own metrics. We need to be able to hold ourselves accountable to, are we doing this work? How well are we doing this work? And so we started to ask questions like, okay, so we're saying amongst ourselves in our grant making space that we want to be prioritizing our dollars towards BIPOC-led and serving organizations. But what tool do we have? Like, are we accountable to that? How are we accountable to that? And that's what led us to conversations around demographic data collection. And also in 2020, with the impacts of the pandemic, like many funders, we leaned in harder than we had previously on trust-based philanthropy. And so really, we've spent time wrestling with this question of how do we balance that we're trying to ease the burden on our funded partners while also arriving at this clarity that we really need to know who's leading the work, who's informing the work, who's involved in the work, in order to be able to assess the impact of our resources and community, but also to assess ourselves and to hold ourselves accountable to our mission. And that's what brought us to Candid as our partner in collecting and analyzing demographic data. We did some research about various options, considered our own demographic data collections, reform and taxonomy, and through conversations with other local funders, we really discerned that using an existing platform with a simple, streamlined demographic data collection taxonomy and existing resources for nonprofit organizations would be the simplest for us, but more importantly, the simplest for our funded partners. And so we solidified a relationship, an MOU with Candid in late 2021, and we're preparing to start collecting demographic data collection from our funded partners in 2022. And then we took some time and hit pause and just realized we really haven't asked our funded partners, how will this impact you? We haven't really centered the expertise of our funded partners in this process. So we slowed down a little bit and took the opportunity to engage a cohort of our funded partners. We put out a call and said, hey, here's an opportunity. This thing is coming. Starting in 2023, we're going to require demographic data through claiming your Candid profile. We offered a small stipend and asked folks, like, would you volunteer to be part of a pilot and go through this process and give us feedback on the process? And I was, frankly, I was a little nervous that we wouldn't get interest. I was hoping for a cohort of 10 organizations, and we have about 120 funded partners on an annual basis, and more than 40 organizations expressed an interest in being part of the pilot, which was astounding to me and really underlines the fact that demographic data is emerging as a really critical part of the work in the nonprofit sector, and that our funded partners are eager to get their hands on this data about their work and to be able to use it to inform their own diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and processes and learning. So we were really intentional on selecting among those many volunteers a cohort that really reflected the variety of the partners that we work with. We had large orgs, small orgs, fiscally sponsored orgs. We had BIPOC-led, Black-led organizations. We had white dominant organizations. The stipend, it was small. It was $250, which ideally we would have been able to provide more as a stipend, but we really wanted to just provide something as recognition of the labor and the feedback and the insights that our partners were providing. So we worked through that process, provided some supports and check-ins throughout the process with our pilot partners, and then gathered feedback from them at the end. And if you would advance to the next slide. The feedback from our partners about the process with Candid was overwhelmingly positive. Folks were saying that the process was simple and straightforward, and the sample surveys that Candid provides were incredibly helpful, and the step-by-step guides were really useful as they planned out their processes. And we also put together some additional resources. So we had a 10-week kind of timeline of, do these tasks in week 1 and week 2 and week 3, not as a requirement that folks follow that, but just as a sample for breaking out the work and pacing. We also had sample communications that we shared for how to message to your staff and board, why you're collecting this information, how it will be used, how it will be shared with, things along those lines. And then we had the opportunity in gathering feedback from our pilot partners to ask them, so how were those resources that we provided and that Candid provided, were they enough? What else did you need? What did we not give you, right? That would have made this process simpler. And then we've used all of that feedback and insight and suggestions that we received from our partners to inform how we rolled out our demographic data collection requirement across all of our funded partners starting this year in 2023. We are doing that softly, I'll say. We're not discounting anyone from grant consideration this year if they have not claimed their Candid profile. We recognize that this is one more thing on top of the grant request and all of the other hundreds of moving pieces that nonprofit folks are juggling every week. And so are just having follow-up conversations with folks who weren't able to claim that, to understand where their barriers, how can we support, and to communicate, our expectations moving forward. This here on the screen is just a snapshot from our grant making guide, which is about a 15 or 20 page resource that we update annually and provide to our funded partners to try to be transparent about our processes, what we're looking for, how we evaluate requests, things like that. And so we've added content, of course, about our demographic data requirements, as well as on our website. We've built out a section with all kinds of downloadable resources and things along those lines that partners can access to support this process. And then on the next slide, I included a screenshot of the Community Foundation's demographic data on Candid. I think as a funder, it's incredibly important for me in conversations with the partners that I work most closely with to always, own and acknowledge that I work for an organization that has historically been dominated by white folks. And we have our own work and journey and process that we continue to be on around representation and diversity and inclusion, and ensuring that the voices at our tables represent the voices of our community. So this is a snapshot from our Candid profile as well.
So Ali, that it sounds like you are in the sort of early stages, but I think you do have some insights into a couple of things. One is, what were the kinds of supports that people thought were most helpful because you provided a lot. It sounds like you provided a lot of opportunities. What were most helpful? And then again, if you can also share, because this is a conversation about, okay, so now we have it, what do we do with it? Talk about some of the some of the ways that people not only use their own demographic data, the data that they collected for themselves, but then also how the foundation is or plans to use what you collect from nonprofits.
Sure, absolutely. I think what I heard most clearly from partners was that the sample messaging for how to talk to your board and staff about demographic data collection was really the most helpful. And maybe second place would be samples, the demographic data surveys in different formats. So we provided a fillable PDF and a Microsoft Forms and a Google Forms version. And I think that was helpful just to meet the needs of different organizations and how they do business. But the sample messaging, I think in particular, was helpful because this can be a sensitive conversation to enter into, especially if you have not already been having this conversation with your board or with your staff. Some demographic data, for folks is sensitive to answer these questions. It might be very personal. I might, have some needs around reassurance to make sure that my personal information will be, managed in ways that I'm comfortable with and shared with folks in ways that I'm comfortable with. So I think the sample messaging really removed a step in the process or eased a step in the process for nonprofit partners, just in that it was a starting place. How do I talk about this with folks? In terms of what we're hearing from organizations about how they're using the data, it really runs the gamut. We've heard about folks using their own demographic data collection to outline a board recruitment plan. For example, we have a youth literacy organization that we work really closely with. This is a Black-led organization. At the board and staff level, they serve predominantly Black and Brown youth in the community. And what they saw in their demographic data collection was that they didn't have anyone at the board level that is living with a disability. And they know that many of the youth that they work with have disabilities. And so that realization pushed them to think, okay, how can we partner with our local disability network? How can we outreach to folks in the community who have a disability and are passionate about youth literacy, and take some time over the course of 12 to 18 months to really build out the training that we need to be an inclusive and welcoming environment at the board level for folks with disabilities, and then find those folks, to bring on board to really ensure that we have a full reflection of the youth that we work with, guiding our organization. We've also heard from organizations about once they've realized, oh, wow, we have a significant gap around, X, Y, or Z identity at the staff level, that they're evaluating their hiring practices. What interview questions are we asking? What are the requirements that we're putting on position descriptions? Where are we advertising our position openings? And what do we need to shift to make sure that we are reaching candidates, whether it's candidates of color, whether it's, female candidates, LGBTQ candidates, things like that. We've also heard from folks who are outlining learning plans for their board and identifying trainings and things like that, because they're clear that, wow, we have a majority white board. We've struggled to onboard and retain board members of color. So before we try to do that, we need to really dig into what are the barriers? What about our board culture is not inclusive to people of color? How are we going to shift that? And things along those lines. So those are some brief examples of how we're hearing from our partners about how they're using the data. I could go on and on. So, stop me if you need to, Kelly. In terms of how we're using the data internally, this year in 2023, we're really using the data on our individual partners as a benchmark and a segue into a conversation. So where we have partners where we are seeing really significant gaps, whether it's, an organization that serves a majority people of color and their board is overwhelmingly white, or their staff is overwhelmingly white, or perhaps, it's an organization that has a really racially diverse board, but there are no LGBTQ people on the board, or, no folks with disabilities, things along those lines. We're having those conversations with them to say, okay, hey, so here's the data, here's what we're seeing. What are you going to do about it? What is the action plan, right? What is the action plan? What steps will you take to ensure that you are moving towards building a board and a staff that really reflect the identities of the folks that you work with in the community? And that is the entry point into accountability, right? So that if next year we're looking at their grant request again and we're seeing that there's no progress made, that will likely shape and inform the decisions that we're making in the grant making space. But for this year, our emphasis is clear feedback and really being direct with people about where we're seeing gaps and trying to offer concrete support and encouragement, right? Of, okay, so here's this gap. What are you going to do about it? How can I come alongside you and support you in addressing the gap?
So Allie, we have a request. Would it be possible to share the messaging materials with attendees here?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. And what Viewpoint is doing as a follow-up is to curate resources, and those will be posted at the end of this series. So we'll be sure to include those there. There's another question for you in the chat. What data do you use to benchmark your success in quotes and for you to know if you're making progress?
So I'm going to answer this question two ways. First, I'll talk about how we're measuring success or what success looks like, or sort of what the benchmark is with our individual partner organizations. Folks have been asking over and over again since we started talking about demographic data in early 2022, what is good enough? Like what am I being measured against? And what we continue to communicate to our partners is look at the demographics of the folks that you're working with. If you're a neighborhood-based organization, look at the neighborhood. If you're an organization that works in schools, look at the demographics of those schools. Look at who you work with in terms of their identities. If you're working with queer youth and you don't have queer folks guiding that work, that's a concern. And to really, for each organization to set their own benchmarks and their own definition of what does representative leadership look like for us based on the demographics of the folks that they work with directly. In terms of us at the foundation, this is our benchmarking year. So we haven't set specific metrics because we don't know where we've been. But what we'll be evaluating at the end of this year is what percentage of our grant dollars went to BIPOC-led organizations. And then also what was the average grant award size to BIPOC-led organizations versus to white-led organizations. And once we see that data at the end of this year, we'll then set specific targets for 2024 and beyond to ensure that we are holding ourselves accountable to moving towards our mission and our vision as quickly as we can.
Yeah. So that's helpful. And again, we really want to encourage other folks to jump in with their questions and comments and reactions, as well. But, I think, again, I've been doing this, a long time. And again, because I think we think about data as something sort of very static and tactical and numerical and what have you. But, I always try and remind people that this is information, right? This is data, this is information. And I think it's very easy sometimes to get sort of caught in these, as what I sort of say, thresholds and dashboards, right? Sort of, how like what we're seeing right here on the screen is easy to to get, focused on those things and think that there is a threshold that's enough. But I think it's important to remember that part of the reason why it's critical to have different kinds of perspectives and representative perspectives and things like that is because they actually help you do better work, right? They actually change the way you do your work. It's not just like, okay, we got to a magic number of 4 Black people and everything is wonderful. It's just like there is part of the muscle that goes into stretching in that way, whether it's across race or ability or what have you, language, is that it makes the folks who are there kind of do better work. I sometimes tell the story around, hearing an account of a food bank that was very vested in providing, sound services to the stakeholders who were accessing the food bank, and they realized that the food bank was in a food desert, and they wanted to provide fresh food for folks who were accessing, the traditional foods that were in a food bank. So they organized to get fresh food brought in and make it available to folks at the food bank. And after some period of time of providing this, they realized that people were not actually accessing the fresh food, right? And they couldn't understand, well, why don't they, everyone's clear, you're in a food desert, this isn't easy to access. What, maybe they don't know how to cook it. What's the issue? Why don't we, aren't they availing themselves of this intervention? And so they finally decided to ask folks what was, what happened. And the participants said, well, we can only access the food bank twice a month. Fresh food is perishable. We need food that's going to last us from the first time we access the food bank to the second time. So that's why we're going to get non-perishable things and canned goods and what have you. It's not as if we don't understand what to do with fresh food. And I think, when I share that anecdote, the point is to understand why it's important to have these perspectives as part of your strategy, because even with well-intentioned designs and goals and objectives, and even with well-informed, because there was nothing about the provision of fresh food that was wrong, but there was something about that range of perspectives that actually makes even good work better. And I'm wondering if you have any anecdotes or people telling you around not just that we got, we increased our recruiting to reach more people, but if people shared stories with you around how we actually are doing better work as a result of paying attention to these things.
Sure. The first example that comes to mind is there's a local partner in our community that they provide free critical home repair services to low-income families, and in some core neighborhoods around our downtown area that are, historically disinvested, redlined neighborhoods. And this organization has historically been led by primarily white men with backgrounds in the construction trades. And overwhelmingly, the folks who are accessing home repair services through this organization are women of color, often, single head of households with young children. And this organization started on a journey of really deepening their relationships with similar organizations or organizations in the same neighborhoods that were led by women of color. And so that doesn't directly translate to their board demographics yet, right? Like long term, that they're hoping to deepen those relationships in a really authentic way, and that will contribute to a turning of the tide in their board and staff demographics. But to your point, Kelly, it's about the relationship. It's about who are we listening to? Who are we asking questions of? Whose voice is here? Who's considered the expert in this space? And so when they began this process of really just listening, what they learned was that many pregnant women were applying for support from this program in the hopes that this critical issue in their home, this safety issue in their home, whether it's a leaking roof or a hot water heater issue or something absolutely critical, would be repaired before their child was born and brought home to that space. And this organization had a sort of universal waiting list, first come, first serve, a little bit of priority ranking based on the severity of the issue. And what they realized through this listening process with organizations around them who were working alongside the same families and who were led by women of color was, okay, we need to rethink our waiting list, and we need to move pregnant women to the top, because it is so pressing that they have this home repair done before they try to bring that baby home into that space. And so they've been piloting that new initiative for about 6 months now. And the outcomes, what they're seeing, I can't, quote their specific outcomes data, but they're seeing just these like really profound shifts for these families that then enable them to bring their babies home without as much worry or concern about the safety of their child. And so I think that's an example, not quite in the board and staff demographic space, but of what happens when an organization that doesn't have, folks all around the table who have lived experience and share identities with the folks on the receiving end of the resource or the service, stop and listen, stop and ask a question, because you're actually strengthening the work that you're doing. And as we were talking about the other day, Kelly, like there is a business case for demographic data. There is a business case for having folks sitting around your tables who share identities with or share lived experiences with the folks that you're working.
Super helpful. Again, would love to hear folks' thoughts, but I guess one question that I have, and you sort of alluded to in some of our prep conversation, and to some degree it relates, I think, to what what are the as I mentioned, kind of the legal environment that we are in, where they're kind of the whole idea of redressing past wrongs or even promoting inclusion and equity is being scrutinized. Is sort of what do you do, or what are you hearing from, or are you hearing from organizations or efforts who basically say this isn't important to me? Like, I don't think this is value. I think everybody should be the same, treated the same. I don't think we should, this is necessarily when you say, moving toward progress, I feel like we're doing good work, and without attention to these kinds of things, how do you respond to that? Because I'm sure there are going to be folks around the table who, who are going to get that.
Mm-hmm. There will always be resistance, right? And fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, we haven't really heard those comments that directly, and yet we hear the rumblings of resistance, right? And at the end of the day, I can't force anyone to share, my opinion or the values of my foundation in terms of what we're prioritizing around demographic data and representative leadership. And yet, these are our expectations for our funded partners. There are other funding sources available if folks, don't want to engage, don't want to participate, don't believe that diversity and representation matters. That's for them to decide. That's for their organization to decide. How we're really seeing resistance is a lot of, there's some fear mongering happening among some of the larger, longer term white-led organizations in our community, who I think feel the heat of that light shining on them in this moment of, it is suddenly becoming transparent and public that they have not made any progress in terms of diversifying their organization. And what that looks like is we'll hear rumors, right? So I've had several funded partners reach out to me and say, I've heard from multiple sources that the Community Foundation will now only give grants to organizations that serve 100% people of color. Is that accurate? No, that's not accurate at all. I don't think there's a single organization we work with who is serving 100% people of color, right? But it's that fear, it's that anxiety that's churned up by the requirement around transparency. And so we hear some of those kinds of rumors. And so we just try to really, dispel them and talk frankly about what we're looking for. We're looking for transparency around who is guiding your work. And we're looking for you to be able to articulate really clear strategies for how you're moving towards greater representation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I also think there is sometimes let's see. I hear sometimes there is some concern around whether or not, even though in some cases, if you really look at the data that that we have, there is sort of a disparate and unequal distribution of resources in general, certainly philanthropic resources in the social sector, but that this move is disadvantaging organizations who may or may not be getting specialized support to engage in this way. But I think you all have addressed that to some degree in terms of using this conversation around data to actually open up some questions around how do people think about their constituencies and their identities, and sort of open up new networks and build new networks. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceptualizing sort of the priority of deploying more resources to organizations led by communities of color, people of color, or people from underrepresented groups, while still realizing that even organizations who aren't there need support and resources too.
Sure, absolutely. When we have a limited amount of some resource available, whether it's, an opportunity to engage in a training, that's being facilitated through the community foundation or something along those lines, we really try to leverage those resources first and primarily towards BIPOC-led, people of color-led organizations. And sometimes that looks like, so for example, one of my colleagues facilitates wellness grants that go specifically to BIPOC leaders. And they can go to them individually or through their organization. And in the second year iteration of that grant process, she's specifically prioritizing BIPOC leaders who are working inside of organizations with a less than $1 million operating budget annually. And just really seeing that it's folks in these more grassroots, smaller, younger organizations that don't have access to things like benefits. $2,000 wellness grant can really go a long way towards facilitating access to what folks need around health and well-being. And so those are just some examples of ways that when we have a resource to share with our funded partners, we really are trying to be strategic and ask the question of who has the greatest barriers to be able to access this resource through some other channels. And what we're clear about is in our community, and I think in communities across the United States, it is primarily BIPOC-led organizations that have barriers to access some of the resources that exist out there, whether it's training, learning, financial resources, grants, all of those things. So, and right, we hold the recognition that even as I'm saying, yes, we're prioritizing resources and opportunities to BIPOC-led organizations, that just myself, right, with my portfolio of partners, I am very often sitting down and having very in-depth conversations with white dominant organizations about sharing resources for how they can build out a board recruitment strategy. I've gone to board meetings to talk to boards about why this matters to the community foundation and what our expectations are. And so even as I'm saying, right, like we're prioritizing certain resources and opportunities towards BIPOC-led organizations, that's also holding the recognition that the entire system of philanthropy is built around the needs of white dominant organizations. And we continue to be in deep relationship and offering lots of support to white-led organizations. It's a both and.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to ask you sort of one sort of last sort of summing up question, and also invite any other questions from from the collaborative members or others, because one thing I'm going to ask you is some advice to them. But I do want to remind and just make a special note to folks that we have dropped in the chat a link to the survey that we've been putting at the end of each webinar to get feedback from you, not only on how the webinar went in the process, but this one is in particular really important. We want to give you some time to think about it, is because we want to ask for your feedback and your input and your questions, because the next session that we'll have on June 20th will be a roundtable of the collaborative, where they'll share a little bit about their own learnings about this process as we move forward, share how they plan to use it or are already using it to some degree, and then be open to your questions directly for your funders around your issues and your challenges and your concerns around the state and how you want it to be used, as well as what might be additional supports or resources that you might need beyond this, this original or this preliminary series. So just want to draw folks' attention to that link in that survey, and really encourage you to fill it out. So are there any questions from the collab or anyone else, or anyone out there, before I pose one last question to Allie? If not, Allie, what I'll ask you to just again share, this is, you're fairly early in your process. So I'm going to ask for you to share sort of like what is one piece of advice you would give to nonprofits who are confronting funders, stakeholders, what have you, around this data, whether it's getting it, using it, prioritizing it, thinking about it, talking about it, just based on your experience, what is one thing you would say, in an overarching way to folks who are on the receiving end of these requests? And then to supplement, I guess, since we have our collaborative partners on the call as well, is from the perspective of a peer foundation. What's one piece of advice you would also give to the collaborative partners around, just good practice, good or learning from what you're learning in terms of how to engage folks around it, how to use it? Just one piece of advice for both of those audiences.
Sure. I think I have the same piece of advice for both audiences, and it looks a little different on both sides. I think my piece of advice would be take your time. Like, collecting demographic data, it sounds like something that you could do quickly and make a survey, send it out, get the data, report it. And yet, slow down, take time for nonprofits, take the time to really talk with your staff, talk with your board about why this matters, how you'll use it, what's emerging in the sector, right? Like, have those conversations, take the time to build buy-in within your organization. Because there might be some resistance, there might be some fear, there might be some anxiety. And with some diligent conversation and continued clarity, you can arrive right at a place of greater unity around that. So for nonprofits, take your time, talk with your people, build shared understanding for why this matters and how you'll use it. And then similarly for funders, take your time. There's urgency here and this matters and you need to be moving forward quickly, and yet take the time to listen to your partners, take the time to practice something, to test something, to gather feedback. I'm so glad we did a pilot because we learned so many things of what wasn't working, what we needed to create, what we needed to provide. And I'm just really grateful that we had the time and the opportunity to do that before rolling this out to 120 partners and then running into the same bumps over and over again. So have the pace, have the intensity, have the urgency, and also take the time to get it right. Take the time to build shared understanding and collective buy-in for the process.
Thanks. And I would only add is you often don't get it right, you just get better. And that's the most important thing. And also to remember that this isn't where we've tried to also lead. This is data to make us better. And it can be hard and challenging, but the point is to be better. And better is measured in lots of different ways. But this is really, to remember the aspirational aspect of this, that more information will make us all better. So I just want to end on some key points around data is the only starting point. It's legal, but the landscape is changing. So we're going to support you in trying to stay abreast and aware of this, but it's all about learning, adapting, and making progress. So as we conclude, I want to thank Ali for her contribution and her thoughts and her insights and sharing her experience, and all of our partners around the table. Again, a reminder that the next session, the last session, is June 20th. Again, it's going to be obviously optional. It's going to be an opportunity for you to talk with the collaborative partners around all of this effort, the work, giving you a chance to digest what you've heard over the past few weeks. Bring your questions, bring your ideas, bring your thoughts, bring your reflections. Please fill out the survey so that we can capture all of that and prepare as much as possible for that session to allow you to get the most out of this this effort and these conversations, and hopefully to establish what might come next from the collaborative partners. And also this is information that is going to fuel the field. As I mentioned early on, we're going to take this to to the field, what we're learning here, what we're hearing from you. So we really want to avail you of the opportunity to tell us what you think. And so on that note, unless there's anything from the collaborative partners, we'll close down this session and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. You're awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for having me out.